Order in the court. Judge Geraldson's gavel slammed against the wooden desk, but the laughter in the room drowned it out. The courtroom, usually a place of seriousness, had turned into a scene of mockery. Lawyers smirked. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the bailiff, a man who rarely cracked a smile, was struggling to keep a straight face. At the center of it all stood a young black teenager, barely 16, her small hands gripping the table in front of her. She wore a cheap blazer, too big for her frame, and a pair of glasses that looked like they belonged to an old librarian. The moment she opened her mouth to speak, the entire courtroom burst into laughter. Judge Geraldson leaned forward, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Young lady, this is a courtroom, not a school debate club. What are you doing here?" The girl cleared her throat, trying to maintain her composure. "Your Honor, I am here to represent my client." The room roared with laughter again. Even the opposing attorney, a seasoned lawyer with gray hair and a smug grin, shook his head. "Represent your client?" The judge chuckled, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. "Do you even know what a subpoena is?" The girl's expression didn't waver. "Yes, Your Honor. And I also know that mockery and intimidation have no place in a fair trial." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge's amusement faded slightly, but he was still shaking his head. "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Who let this child in here pretending to be an attorney?" A man in the audience leaned forward, whispering, "This is crazy. What kind of joke is this?" The judge sighed dramatically and turned to the courtroom officers. "Get her out of here before this becomes a complete circus." But then, the girl calmly reached into her briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of papers, and placed them on the table. "Before you dismiss me, Your Honor, you might want to take a look at these." The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't touch the papers. "And what exactly am I looking at?" The girl smiled, her voice steady. "Proof that I have every legal right to be here. In fact, I'm more qualified than you think." The courtroom fell into complete silence. The laughter stopped. The judge's face paled slightly as he hesitated, then finally picked up the papers. His eyes scanned the document. Then he blinked. Then he read it again. The courtroom watched in anticipation as his fingers gripped the paper tighter. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead. For the first time in his long career, Judge Geraldson looked shocked. And then, everything changed. A week earlier, the world was still ordinary for Olivia Carter. She was just another girl from the south side of Chicago, walking home from school with her backpack slung over her shoulder. Her mother, a hardworking nurse, was always at the hospital, and her little brother, Malik, was waiting at home. Olivia had always been different. While other kids played basketball after school, she spent hours at the library, buried in thick law books. She read about famous trials, studied legal loopholes, and practiced arguments in front of her bathroom mirror. She had one dream, to become a lawyer. But there was one problem. No one believed in her. At school, her teachers told her to be more realistic. At home, her mother sighed whenever Olivia mentioned law school. "Baby, we can't afford that. You need to focus on something practical." But Olivia refused to give up. Then, one night, something happened that changed everything. She was at the community center, helping kids with their homework, when a desperate man burst through the doors. His name was Mr. Jenkins, a kind man who owned a small grocery store in their neighborhood. His eyes were red from crying. "They're trying to take my store," he said, his voice shaking. Everyone gathered around as he explained that a big company had filed a lawsuit against him. They claimed he had violated a contract he had never even seen. The court date was in a week, and he had no lawyer. "I can't afford one," Mr. Jenkins said. "They're going to take everything." The room fell silent. Then Olivia stood up. "I'll help you," she said. The room burst into laughter, just like in the courtroom later. Even Mr. Jenkins gave her a sad smile. "Olivia, this is serious. I need a real lawyer." But Olivia didn't back down. "Just let me try. If I fail, you can still ask for more time to get a lawyer. But if I win..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Mr. Jenkins sighed but nodded. He had nothing to lose. That night, Olivia stayed up until sunrise. She read every law book she could find, studied past cases, and even sneaked into online legal classes. She taught herself everything she could in a few days. And somehow, against all odds, she found a loophole. A week later, she walked into the courtroom, head held high, dressed in her oversized blazer, and with her client beside her. And now, here she was, standing in front of a judge who had just mocked her. And in his hands, he held the proof that she was not just some kid playing dress-up, but a force to be reckoned with. Before he could say a word, the doors to the courtroom swung open, and in walked someone who would change everything. The courtroom doors swung open with a loud creak. Everyone turned their heads, curious to see who had just entered. A tall man in a sharp navy blue suit walked in, his presence commanding immediate attention. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his polished shoes clicked against the floor as he strode forward. In his hand was a leather briefcase, and his piercing eyes scanned the room before settling on Olivia. The whispers started instantly. "Isn't that Richard Hastings?" someone murmured. "No way. That's one of the top attorneys in the country. What's he doing here?" Even Judge Geraldson's face twitched with recognition. He cleared his throat and sat up straighter in his chair. "Mr. Hastings, what brings you to my courtroom?" Hastings didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked right up to Olivia's table and stopped beside her. He looked at her, then at the judge, and finally at the papers in Geraldson's hands. "I was told there was an unusual case happening here today," Hastings said, his deep voice carrying through the silent room. Olivia clenched her fists. She had no idea who this man was, but she didn't need anyone interfering. This was her case. "I don't need any help," she said firmly. Hastings raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "That remains to be seen." The judge tapped his gavel impatiently. "Mr. Hastings, I don't know what you think is happening here, but this is a joke. This girl," he jabbed a finger toward Olivia, "has no business being in this courtroom. She is not an attorney." Hastings smirked and folded his arms. "Is that so?" The judge slammed the papers down onto his desk. "Of course. She's a teenager playing pretend." Hastings leaned over, picked up the stack of documents, and scanned them quickly. His smirk faded as his eyes moved across the page. Slowly, he looked at Olivia, his expression unreadable. Then, he chuckled. A real, genuine chuckle. "This," he said, waving the papers in the air, "is the most interesting thing I've seen in years." Judge Geraldson's face turned red. "Are you seriously entertaining this nonsense?" Hastings turned serious. "I don't entertain nonsense, Your Honor. I deal in facts. And according to these documents, Olivia Carter is more prepared to be in this courtroom than half the lawyers I've mentored." The courtroom gasped. The judge's eyes widened, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "That is ridiculous. A teenager cannot represent a client in a legal case. It's against the law." Olivia lifted her chin. "Actually, Your Honor, I've done my research." She turned, flipping through her own papers, then read aloud. "Under the state's legal code, any individual may assist in a court case if they have the necessary knowledge and if their client voluntarily accepts their representation. There is no specific age restriction listed in the statute." A beat of silence. Then murmurs erupted across the room. "She's right," someone whispered. "That can't be real." Hastings grinned and patted Olivia on the back. "She's absolutely right." The judge's face darkened. "Even if that's true, this is a serious legal matter. You cannot expect me to allow this farce to continue." Olivia's heart pounded. She had anticipated pushback, but she hadn't expected this level of hostility. "I understand your concern, Your Honor, but my client is facing an unfair lawsuit, and no one else is willing to help him. I am his last hope." Mr. Jenkins, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke up. His voice was filled with desperation. "She's the only one who actually listened to me. I trust her." The judge ran a hand through his thinning hair. He was trapped. He knew Olivia had technically found a loophole, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it so easily. Hastings took a step forward. "Your Honor, if I may," he gestured toward Olivia. "Let her make her case. If she's truly as unqualified as you claim, she'll fail, and you'll have your victory. But if she succeeds," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Judge Geraldson clenched his jaw. He stared at Olivia, his eyes burning with frustration. Finally, he exhaled sharply. Fine, he spat. You want to embarrass yourself in my courtroom? Be my guest. But don't expect me to go easy on you. A slow smile spread across Olivia's face. I wouldn't dream of it. The crowd gasped again, shocked at her confidence. The judge pounded his gavel. Court is now in session. The tension in the room thickened. Olivia could feel the weight of every eye on her. And then, the opposing attorney, the smug older man who had been watching everything with amusement, stood up. His name was Walter Grayson, a high-powered corporate lawyer with a reputation for crushing his opponents. He smirked as he adjusted his expensive suit. Well then, little Miss Lawyer, he said smoothly, let's see if you're as clever as you think you are. The game had officially begun. That night, Olivia sat at her kitchen table, flipping through case files. Her mother, exhausted from her shift at the hospital, watched from the doorway with a worried expression. Liv, you sure you want to do this? She asked softly. Olivia didn't look up. I have to. Her mother sighed and sat across from her. Baby, you're 16. This is a courtroom, not a school project. What if you lose? Olivia finally met her mother's eyes. Then I lose trying to do the right thing. Her mother swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with pride and fear. I just don't want you getting hurt. Olivia reached for her mother's hand and squeezed it. I won't. Deep down, though, she knew the truth. She had just stepped into a battle against some of the most powerful people in the legal world, and she wasn't sure she was ready. But there was no turning back now. The next morning, she walked into the courthouse, her heart pounding. The moment she stepped inside, she saw something that made her freeze. A massive billboard had been set up outside the building. On it was her face, and the words written in bold letters. The teenager who thinks she's a lawyer. Live courtroom humiliation today. The world was watching, and they were waiting for her to fail. The giant billboard loomed over Olivia like a storm cloud, its bold words flashing in the morning sunlight. The teenager who thinks she's a lawyer. Live courtroom humiliation today. Her stomach twisted into knots. Crowds of reporters and onlookers had gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing and microphones pointed in every direction. The air buzzed with excitement, like they were here for some kind of spectacle. People whispered as she walked past. That's her. She's just a kid. There's no way she wins this case. Olivia's heart pounded, but she forced herself to keep walking. She wouldn't let them see her fear. She had come too far to turn back now. As she approached the courthouse steps, Richard Hastings appeared beside her, his face unreadable. I see the media caught wind of your little stunt, he said. Olivia swallowed hard. I don't care. Hastings smirked. Good. Then let's give them a show. They stepped inside, and the energy shifted immediately. The cold, quiet air of the courthouse was in sharp contrast to the chaos outside. Olivia could hear the faint murmuring of attorneys preparing their cases, the shuffling of papers, the creak of old wooden benches. She took a deep breath. This is where it really begins. Inside the courtroom, Mr. Jenkins was already seated at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together. When he saw Olivia, his face filled with both hope and doubt. You sure about this, kid? He whispered. Olivia nodded. More than ever. The sound of a gavel striking the desk made everyone fall silent. All rise, the bailiff called. Judge Geraldson entered, looking even more irritated than the day before. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp as they landed on Olivia. He had allowed her to stay, but it was clear he expected her to fail. The opposing attorney, Walter Grayson, rose from his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his $1,000 suit. His smirk was unwavering as he turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, today we witnessed something unusual. He began smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. A teenager, barely old enough to drive, standing before you, claiming to be an attorney. Soft chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Olivia clenched her fists under the table. Grayson continued, I have spent 30 years practicing law, winning cases against some of the best minds in this country. And today, I am expected to take this, he gestured toward Olivia. Seriously? Another chuckle from the jury. Grayson shook his head and sighed dramatically. But let's entertain this fantasy, shall we? He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case immediately. This young lady lacks the necessary credentials to argue in a court of law. Judge Geraldson exhaled, almost as if he was waiting for this moment. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Olivia. Miss Carter, do you have a response before I make my ruling? Olivia stood slowly, her palms sweating. The entire room was watching her, waiting for her to stumble, to freeze, to prove she was nothing more than a child pretending to play lawyer. But she didn't freeze. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. Your Honor, I expected this challenge. Mr. Grayson assumes that because of my age, I am not capable of representing my client. But the law does not discriminate based on age, only on ability. Grayson smirked. Ability you don't have. Olivia ignored him and continued. I have spent weeks preparing for this case, studying the legal system, and understanding every detail of this lawsuit. If Mr. Grayson is so confident that I am unqualified, then surely it will be easy for him to defeat me in a fair trial. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Hastings leaned back in his chair, watching with interest. Judge Geraldson sighed, rubbing his temple. He clearly didn't want to let this continue, but Olivia had trapped him. If he dismissed the case now, it would look like he was afraid to let her try. Fine, the judge grumbled. Proceed. Grayson's smirk faltered just slightly. Clearly, he hadn't expected the judge to allow this. Olivia sat back down, exhaling quietly. Round 1. Survived. Grayson recovered quickly, straightening his tie. Very well, he said. Let's begin. He turned to the jury. The facts are simple. Mr. Jenkins signed a contract with my client, a large and well-respected corporation. He broke that contract. Now, he must face the consequences. He walked to the judge's bench, setting down a thick folder. I have the signed agreement here, along with proof that Mr. Jenkins violated the terms. He turned and smiled at Olivia. Would the young lady like to read it, or shall I summarize? Olivia didn't hesitate. I'll read it myself. Grayson's smile flickered just a little as she reached forward and took the document. The room was silent as Olivia's eyes scanned the pages, absorbing every detail. Her brain worked quickly, piecing things together. And then, she saw it. A tiny, almost invisible clause at the bottom of the page. Her heart pounded. There it is. She set the paper down, looking up at Grayson. You said my client broke this contract, correct? Grayson smirked. That's what the document says. Olivia nodded. Then tell me, Mr. Grayson, how can someone break a contract they never legally signed? The courtroom gasped. Grayson's smirk vanished. What? Olivia flipped to the last page of the contract, pointing at the signature. This document states that Mr. Jenkins agreed to the terms. But if you look closely, that is not his signature. Judge Geraldson frowned. Explain. Olivia held up the contract. Mr. Jenkins' name is printed here, but his signature is missing. And if you compare this to his actual signature on previous legal documents, she slid another piece of paper across the table. You'll see that they don't match. The judge's eyes narrowed as he examined the papers. Then, his head snapped up. Mr. Grayson, explain this. Grayson's face paled. This must be a mistake. Olivia shook her head. No, Mr. Grayson, this is fraud. The courtroom exploded into murmurs. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. The jury exchanged stunned glances. Grayson's confidence crumbled as he flipped through his own papers, realizing the mistake. Judge Geraldson's voice boomed through the courtroom. Mr. Grayson, if this is true, your entire case falls apart. Grayson swallowed hard, his forehead glistening with sweat. He glanced at Olivia, and for the first time since this trial began, he looked nervous. Olivia sat back in her chair, her heart racing. She had just flipped the entire case upside down. But before she could celebrate, the doors to the courtroom suddenly burst open. A man in a dark suit rushed in, his expression frantic. He walked straight up to Grayson and whispered something in his ear. Grayson's face drained of color. Then he turned, looking directly at Olivia. And in that moment, she knew. Something big was about to happen. The man in the dark suit whispered urgently into Walter Grayson's ear, his voice so low that no one else could hear. But whatever he said made Grayson's face go pale. Olivia watched closely, gripping the edges of her chair. "What's going on?" Grayson stiffened, then nodded slightly before whispering something back. The man turned and hurried out of the courtroom, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. The entire courtroom was silent, waiting. Judge Geraldson narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Grayson, do you have something to say?" Grayson hesitated. His usual smug expression was gone, replaced by something Olivia hadn't seen before: uncertainty. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a short recess." A wave of murmurs spread across the room. "A recess?" Judge Geraldson said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Why?" Grayson forced another smile. "Just a minor, procedural issue. It won't take long." Olivia's heart pounded. Something isn't right. The judge tapped his fingers on the desk, considering. Then, with a sharp nod, he relented. "Fine. 10-minute recess." He banged his gavel. As soon as he did, Grayson practically bolted from the room. Olivia turned to Richard Hastings, who had been observing everything from the side. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Hastings nodded, rubbing his chin. "Oh, I saw it. And whatever that was, it wasn't good for them." Mr. Jenkins leaned in, his face still filled with nerves. "What does this mean?" Olivia took a deep breath. "I don't know yet, but something just shook them up, and that means we hit a nerve." She had exposed the fraudulent signature, but this reaction was bigger than she expected. What was Grayson hiding? Outside the courtroom, Grayson stormed down the hallway, his jaw clenched. He pulled out his phone and dialed furiously. The moment the call connected, he hissed, "You told me everything was handled." A deep voice on the other end responded, "It was. Until that girl found the signature discrepancy." Grayson ran a hand through his hair, trying to stay calm. "Do you have any idea what happens if this comes out? If that contract is voided?" A pause. Then the voice on the other end spoke slowly. "Then the entire deal falls apart." Grayson cursed under his breath. "I need time." She caught one flaw. What if she finds more? Silence. Then, a chilling response. "Then we make sure she doesn't." Grayson's breath hitched. "What are you suggesting?" The voice lowered. "She's just a kid. Maybe she needs a little convincing to drop this case." Grayson closed his eyes, tension radiating through him. He knew exactly what that meant. And for the first time since this case began, he started to feel fear. Back in the courtroom, Olivia sat quietly, going over the contract again. Something still felt off. The fraudulent signature was big, but what else were they hiding? She barely noticed when a shadow fell over her table. Richard Hastings leaned in. "We have a problem." She looked up, frowning. "What do you mean?" Hastings lowered his voice. "I don't know who that man was, but whatever he told Grayson, it shook him." Olivia nodded. "I saw." Hastings studied her for a moment. Then he leaned in even closer. "Listen to me, kid. You just put a crack in something big. And when powerful people start to feel threatened, they don't always play fair." A chill ran down Olivia's spine. Was he warning her? She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the courtroom doors slammed open again. Grayson had returned, and this time, he wasn't alone. A woman in a sleek black suit walked beside him, her presence even more intimidating than his. She was tall, elegant, and carried an air of cold authority. Grayson cleared his throat and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce a new representative for the prosecution." The judge frowned. "New representative?" The woman stepped forward. "My name is Victoria Langston. I am now overseeing this case." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Olivia's stomach twisted. She knew that name. Everyone did. Victoria Langston was one of the most feared attorneys in the country. If she was here, that meant only one thing. The stakes had just been raised. The courtroom was dead silent. Victoria Langston stood beside Walter Grayson, her sharp eyes sweeping the room like a predator sizing up its prey. She was known for taking impossible cases and winning them. If she was here, It meant someone powerful had decided that this case was no longer just a minor inconvenience. It was a threat, and Olivia was that threat. Judge Geraldson narrowed his eyes. Ms. Langston, I was not informed of this change in representation. Victoria's red lips curled into a slight smile. That's because it was just decided, Your Honor. Given the recent developments, my firm has taken a keen interest in this case. She turned, her gaze landing on Olivia. The stare lasted only a second, but Olivia felt it. A silent message. A warning. You are out of your league, little girl. Olivia's hands clenched under the table. She refused to look away. Judge Geraldson exhaled, adjusting his glasses. Fine, but let's not waste any more time. We're proceeding with the trial. He slammed his gavel down. Court is back in session. Victoria Langston smoothed out her blazer and walked toward the jury, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice smooth and controlled. Let's take a step back. Before we allow ourselves to get caught up in distractions, let's focus on the facts. She turned and gestured toward Mr. Jenkins. This man entered into a business agreement. He benefited from that agreement, and now he is trying to weasel his way out of responsibility. She walked toward the judge's bench, picking up the contract Olivia had exposed. My opposing counsel, a high school student, mind you, claims there is an issue with this signature. That's an interesting argument, truly. But let's ask ourselves, does it actually change anything? Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Olivia narrowed her eyes. What was she playing at? Victoria continued, even if there was a clerical error, does that erase the entire agreement? Mr. Jenkins took the money. He received the benefits. And now he wants to pretend none of it happened? She turned to the jury, lowering her voice to a near whisper. I ask you, is that justice? The tension in the room thickened. Olivia's pulse quickened. She's good. Victoria wasn't denying the fraudulent signature. She was twisting it, making it seem like just a technicality, something that didn't matter. And worst of all, Olivia could see some of the jury nodding. She had to act fast. Olivia stood, taking a deep breath. With all due respect, Ms. Langston, she said, you just admitted that the contract was faulty. Victoria turned to her, one eyebrow raised. And Olivia took a step forward. And in any legal agreement, a fraudulent signature invalidates the entire document. Victoria's lips twitched into a small smile. That depends, dear. Is the intent still there? If Mr. Jenkins still agreed to the terms, does one little error erase the whole thing? Olivia swallowed. Victoria was trying to corner her into proving that Mr. Jenkins had agreed to the deal, even if the signature was wrong. She couldn't fall into that trap. Instead, she turned toward the jury. Imagine someone hands you a contract, Olivia said. You look at it, but before you sign, someone else signs it for you. And suddenly, you're being told that you agreed to something you never actually signed. She let that sink in before continuing. If we let this contract stand, then we are saying that anyone can sign away your rights, your business, and your future, without your consent. The jury shifted uncomfortably. She saw some of them frowning, reconsidering. Good. Victoria, however, was completely unfazed. She chuckled softly. That's adorable, she said. You tell a good story, Miss Carter. But courts do not run on emotions. They run on evidence. She turned back to Judge Geraldson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss this fraudulent signature claim as irrelevant to the case at hand. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. Miss Carter, do you have a response? Olivia didn't hesitate. Yes, Your Honor, she said. She grabbed a different paper from her folder and walked toward the bench. This is a copy of the original contract proposal before it was signed. She set it down in front of the judge. The terms in this document and the final signed version are not the same. A gasp rippled through the room. Victoria's expression finally changed. Judge Geraldson frowned, flipping through the pages. Are you saying the terms were altered after Mr. Jenkins received the contract? Olivia nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The original agreement was different. Someone changed the conditions before it was signed. Victoria's jaw tightened. Judge Geraldson turned to the prosecution. Do you have an explanation for this? Grayson fumbled with his papers. Uh, Your Honor, this must be a misunderstanding. Victoria, however, didn't fumble. She took a slow, controlled breath. Then she smiled again. But this time, it was thinner. I need to review these documents before responding, she said smoothly. Your Honor, I request another brief recess. Judge Geraldson studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed. 5-minute recess. The gavel slammed. The moment they stepped outside, Hastings grabbed Olivia by the arm. That was a brilliant move, he whispered. You just forced them into defense mode. Olivia exhaled, her hands still shaking. Yeah, but I don't think they're done yet. And she was right. Because the moment Victoria Langston stepped into the hallway, her entire demeanor changed. She was no longer the confident, smooth-talking attorney. She was furious. She walked straight up to Olivia, towering over her. Listen to me, little girl, she said, her voice a low, deadly whisper. You think you're clever, but you have no idea what you're playing with. Olivia's stomach twisted, but she refused to back down. I know exactly what I'm doing. Victoria leaned in closer. Then you should know. If you keep this up, you're going to regret it. Olivia's throat went dry. Is that a threat? Victoria smirked. It's a warning. She turned on her heel and walked away. Olivia let out a shaky breath, trying to process what had just happened. Then Hastings leaned in and whispered, They're scared. She nodded. I know. But as much as she wanted to celebrate that small victory, a terrible feeling settled in her gut. Victoria Langston wasn't the kind of person who lost easily, and she had just promised Olivia that things were about to get worse. Much, much worse. The weight of Victoria Langston's words hung in the air long after she disappeared down the hallway. If you keep this up, you're going to regret it. Olivia swallowed hard, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She had known this case was big, but now she understood. This wasn't just about Mr. Jenkins' store. It wasn't just about a fraudulent contract. This was about power. And people like Victoria Langston did not lose power without a fight. Richard Hastings placed a hand on Olivia's shoulder. You okay? She nodded, but the truth was, she wasn't sure. She's trying to scare me. And is it working? Olivia hesitated. No. Hastings chuckled. Good answer. But be careful, kid. People like her? They don't bluff. The courtroom doors swung open again. The recess was over. It was time to go back inside. Judge Geraldson's gavel struck the desk. Court is back in session. Victoria Langston stood gracefully, her confidence back in full force, as if the last 5 minutes had never happened. Your Honor, she said smoothly, we have reviewed the documents my young opposing counsel so passionately provided. And while they are certainly interesting, they do not prove intent to deceive. Olivia's hands curled into fists. She's dodging. Victoria continued. Simple mistakes happen in paperwork all the time. A clerical error is not the same as fraud. It does not change the fact that Mr. Jenkins received benefits from this agreement. She turned to the jury. And let's ask ourselves, if this were such an obvious case of fraud, why is a teenager the only one who caught it? Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Olivia's face burned. She turned to Mr. Jenkins, whose hands were gripping the table tightly. She had to fight back. Taking a deep breath, she stood. Your Honor, I would like to call a witness to the stand. The room stilled. Judge Geraldson raised an eyebrow. A witness? Yes, Olivia said. I would like to call Mr. Michael Reed to the stand. A murmur spread through the crowd. Victoria's expression flickered. Just for a second. Hastings leaned in toward Olivia. Who's Michael Reed? Olivia kept her eyes on Victoria. The man who drafted the original version of this contract. The courtroom exploded. Victoria immediately stood. Objection. This witness was not disclosed prior to trial. Judge Geraldson turned to Olivia. Miss Carter, do you have an explanation? Yes, Your Honor, Olivia said calmly. Mr. Reed reached out to my client last night. He had no idea this case was happening. But when he saw the news, he recognized his work and realized that his contract had been altered without his knowledge. The judge's eyes narrowed. And you have proof of this? Olivia held up her phone. He's willing to testify under oath. The tension in the room spiked. Victoria's face remained composed, but Olivia could see it, the slightest twitch in her jaw. Judge Geraldson sighed. Very well. Mr. Reed may take the stand. The doors opened, and a middle-aged man in a gray suit walked inside. His hair was slightly disheveled, and he looked uncomfortable under all the attention. As he sat down, he raised his right hand and took the oath. Olivia approached. Mr. Reed, can you tell the court your occupation? He cleared his throat. I'm a contract writer for a corporate law firm. I draft agreements for companies and businesses. And did you write the original contract for this case?
Yes.
Olivia took a deep breath. Mr. Reed, is this the contract you wrote? She handed him the document, the one with the fraudulent signature. Reed studied it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No, he said. This is not what I wrote. Gasps filled the room. Victoria immediately stood. Objection. Mr. Reed is not an expert witness. His opinion is not legally binding. Judge Geraldson frowned. Overruled. Continue, Miss Carter. Olivia turned back to Reed. Can you tell us what changed? Reed hesitated, then pointed to a section on the page. The original contract had a profit-sharing clause. It stated that Mr. Jenkins would receive 30% of all revenue from the business deal. He flipped to another page. That clause is gone. It was removed. Without it, Mr. Jenkins receives nothing, and the company takes everything. Shocked murmurs filled the room. Olivia's heart raced. There it is. She turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this was no clerical error. This was a deliberate attempt to cheat my client out of what he was owed. Victoria immediately stood. Your Honor, I request a recess to verify these claims. Judge Geraldson studied her, then turned back to Olivia. Miss Carter, how did Mr. Reed obtain this information? Olivia held up her phone. He emailed me a copy of his original contract last night.
It's time-stamped.
The judge turned to Reed. Mr. Reed, is this true? Reed nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to Grayson, whispering something. He nodded quickly and scribbled a note. They were scrambling. Judge Geraldson sighed heavily. This is serious. If these claims hold, this entire lawsuit could be thrown out. He turned to the prosecution. Ms. Langston, do you have a response? Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then, she smiled. But it wasn't a defeated smile. It was the smile of someone who had one last trick up their sleeve. Your Honor, she said smoothly, the validity of this contract is not what's on trial. She turned to the jury. Let's not forget the most important question. Did Mr. Jenkins knowingly accept the terms? Whether the contract changed or not, he still continued doing business under these conditions. The jury hesitated. Olivia's stomach dropped. Victoria was spinning the narrative again. She wasn't denying the fraud. She was making it seem irrelevant. And worst of all, it was working. Judge Geraldson sighed. We will take a brief recess while I review these documents. Court is dismissed for now. The gavel banged. Olivia barely had time to process what had happened before Hastings grabbed her arm. That was huge, he whispered. You just proved fraud. They are on the ropes. Olivia exhaled. Then why doesn't it feel like we won? Before Hastings could answer, Olivia felt a presence behind her. She turned and found Victoria Langston standing there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria smiled, but it wasn't friendly. You're good, she said softly. I'll admit that. Olivia's pulse quickened. But here's the thing, Victoria continued. This isn't about the law anymore. It's about what happens next. Olivia frowned. What does that mean? Victoria leaned in. It means you might want to start watching your back. Then she walked away, leaving Olivia with a sinking feeling in her chest. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about a trial anymore. It was about survival. Olivia stood frozen in place, Victoria Langston's words echoing in her head. You might want to start watching your back. For the first time since stepping into this case, Olivia felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Fear. Not for the trial. Not for losing. But for what came next. Hastings leaned in close. Did she just threaten me? Olivia whispered. Yeah. Mr. Jenkins approached, looking uneasy. I don't like this, he muttered. This ain't just about my store anymore, is it? Olivia swallowed hard. No,
It's bigger.
Hastings nodded. They're scared. And when powerful people get scared, they get dangerous. Before Olivia could respond, the sound of her phone buzzing made her jump. She pulled it out, her hands still shaking slightly. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Hello? For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, a deep, distorted voice whispered. Drop the case. Olivia's heart slammed against her ribs. Who is this? The voice remained eerily calm. Walk away. This isn't your fight. A lump formed in Olivia's throat. And if I don't? A slight pause. Then, you'll find out. The call disconnected. Olivia stared at the phone, her fingers gripping it so tightly they turned white. Hastings noticed her expression. What is it? She turned to him slowly. That was a warning. Mr. Jenkins looked around nervously. I knew this was a mistake. I never should have dragged you into this. Olivia clenched her jaw. They're trying to scare us. Hastings sighed. And it's working. Olivia looked at him sharply. You think I should quit? Hastings studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No, he said. But I think you need to be careful. Later that evening, Olivia sat in her small bedroom, staring at the case files spread across her desk. Her mother knocked softly on the door before peeking inside. Hey, sweetheart. Olivia looked up, exhausted. Hey, Mom. Her mother stepped inside, eyeing the mess of papers. You've been quiet since you got home. Olivia sighed. It's just a lot. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed. You know, when you first told me you wanted to be a lawyer, I thought you were crazy. Olivia smirked. Thanks for the support. Her mother chuckled. But now, I see it. You're really good at this. Olivia felt warmth in her chest. You think so? Her mother took her hands. I know so. But Olivia, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. If this case is putting you in danger. I can't walk away, Olivia interrupted. If I do, they win. Her mother exhaled, rubbing Olivia's knuckles. Then promise me something. Olivia nodded. Anything. Her mother's eyes softened. Promise me you'll be smart. You're fighting powerful people, baby. And when people like that start feeling threatened, they don't play fair. Olivia squeezed her mother's hands. I promise. But as she said the words, her stomach twisted. Because deep down, she knew things were about to get worse. The next morning, Olivia walked into the courthouse, her mind racing with strategies for the trial. She had barely slept, but quitting was not an option. As she stepped through the doors, she noticed something immediately. The energy had changed. Reporters were buzzing, whispering, looking at their phones with wide eyes. Even some of the jurors glanced at her differently. Then, Hastings rushed up to her, his face tense. We have a problem. Olivia frowned. What's wrong? Wordlessly, Hastings pulled out his phone and held it up. On the screen was a news article, and at the very top, in bold letters, it read, Teen lawyer Olivia Carter caught cheating. Fabricated evidence in high-profile case. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed the phone, scrolling down in disbelief. The article claimed that Olivia had faked the documents she submitted, that she had manipulated the evidence to frame the company. It was a lie. But the worst part? People were believing it. Social media was already exploding with the story. I knew she was too young to be real. Just another scam artist. Lock her up. Olivia's stomach churned. This is fake. It's all fake. Hastings nodded. Of course it is. But that doesn't matter. They just made you the bad guy. Olivia swallowed hard. We need to prove it's a lie. Before Hastings could respond, a booming voice echoed through the courthouse.
Miss Carter.
She turned, just in time to see Judge Geraldson standing at the courtroom doors, his expression unreadable. In my office.
Now.
The courtroom gasped. Olivia's heart dropped. This was exactly what Victoria Langston wanted. And now, Olivia wasn't just fighting for the case. She was fighting for her own reputation. The moment Judge Geraldson called Olivia's name, the entire courthouse seemed to hold its breath. Reporters whispered. Jurors exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, who rarely reacted to anything, raised an eyebrow. Hastings leaned in. Stay calm. They want you rattled. Olivia forced herself to take a steady breath. She couldn't let them see fear. She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the judge's office, every step feeling heavier than the last. As soon as she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. Judge Geraldson stood behind his massive wooden desk, arms crossed. He didn't gesture for her to sit. She didn't ask to. For a moment, he just studied her. Then, did you falsify evidence? The words hit like a slap. Olivia's jaw tightened. No, Your Honor. His sharp gaze didn't waver. Then explain this. He turned his computer screen toward her. It was the news article. The words screamed at her in bold. Teen fraudster Olivia Carter. Evidence under investigation. Below that, another headline. Judge Geraldson under scrutiny for allowing unauthorized child lawyer in real court case. Olivia's stomach twisted. This wasn't just an attack on her. They were dragging the judge down with her. And judging by the way his jaw clenched, he knew it. I don't know who planted this story, Olivia said carefully. But it's a lie. Judge Geraldson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. You put me in a difficult position, Miss Carter. This case was already controversial. Now it's a circus. Olivia swallowed. I understand. No, he said sharply. I don't think you do. He exhaled heavily. If there's even a chance you tampered with evidence, I have an obligation to remove you from this case. Olivia's heart stopped. No, she blurted. You can't. The judge raised an eyebrow. I can, and I will, unless you prove to me right now that this story is false. Olivia's mind raced. How could she prove she hadn't faked anything? Then, an idea hit her. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Mr. Reed sent me the original contract via email. The timestamp on the email will prove I didn't forge it. Judge Geraldson narrowed his eyes. Show me. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone and scrolled to the email. There it was. Michael Reed. Original contract attached. Received 11:42 p.m. last night. She turned the screen toward the judge. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he exhaled, his expression shifting slightly. Relief. You're telling the truth, he muttered. Olivia nodded, forcing herself to stay calm. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Geraldson leaned back, rubbing his temples again. Someone is going to great lengths to ruin you. Olivia swallowed hard. I know. He was silent for a moment. Then, finally, he sighed. I'm allowing you to continue. But listen to me very carefully. She nodded. You are stepping on dangerous toes, Miss Carter. This isn't just about a case anymore. Someone is trying to destroy you. Olivia's throat tightened. I won't back down. Judge Geraldson studied her for a long moment. Then, almost begrudgingly, he nodded. Then get back in there and win. Olivia stepped back into the courtroom, and every eye was on her. Hastings was waiting near the defendant's table, arms crossed. You good? She nodded. For now. Mr. Jenkins gave her a nervous glance. Did he? I'm still in. Jenkins sagged in relief. But Olivia knew it wasn't over. She turned her gaze toward Victoria Langston. The powerful attorney sat elegantly at her table, completely unfazed. If she was surprised that Olivia hadn't been removed, she didn't show it. Instead, she smirked. Olivia's stomach twisted. Victoria wasn't done. She had more moves left, and Olivia had a terrible feeling she was about to see one. Judge Geraldson banged his gavel. Court is back in session. Victoria Langston stood, her sharp gaze locked on Olivia. Your Honor, in light of today's controversy, I'd like to call a new witness to the stand. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Judge Geraldson frowned. A new witness? This wasn't discussed. Victoria smiled. We only just received this testimony this morning. Olivia stiffened. What was she doing? Judge Geraldson exhaled. Proceed. Victoria turned toward the courtroom doors. The prosecution calls. She paused for effect, then continued. Mr. Darren Carter. Olivia's blood ran cold. The doors opened, and in walked her father. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Her breath caught in her throat. No. Victoria's smirk widened. Mr. Carter, please take the stand. Olivia's hands shook, because Darren Carter, her father, hadn't been in her life for years. And now, he was here, as a witness, against her. Olivia's world tilted. Her father, Darren Carter, strode into the courtroom, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. She hadn't seen him in 6 years, not since the night he walked out. And now, he was here, called as a witness, against her. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Hastings leaned toward Olivia, his voice low. What the hell is this? Olivia's throat felt tight. I don't know. She couldn't know, because none of this made sense. Darren Carter had never cared about anything. Not about her, not about her mother, not about Malik. So why was he here? Victoria Langston smirked as Darren took the witness stand and raised his right hand. The oath felt surreal, distant, like a nightmare Olivia couldn't wake up from. Judge Geraldson frowned. Ms. Langston, what exactly does this witness have to contribute? Victoria clasped her hands in front of her. Your Honor, Mr. Carter has crucial insight into Miss Carter's character. Olivia's stomach dropped. Oh no. No, no, no. She could already see where this was going. Victoria turned to Darren. Mr. Carter, do you know the defendant's representative, Olivia Carter? Darren glanced at Olivia, his face expressionless. Yes, she's my daughter. A ripple spread through the courtroom. Olivia's heart pounded. Victoria smiled. And do you believe she is trustworthy? The question hit like a punch. Olivia's pulse roared in her ears. She held her breath. Darren shifted in his seat, rubbing his chin. Then, no, he said. The room exploded. Whispers. Gasps. Reporters scribbling furiously. Olivia felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Judge Geraldson banged his gavel. Order. But Olivia barely heard it. She was staring at her father, the man who had abandoned her, the man who had left them to struggle while he disappeared into some new life. And now, he was testifying against her. Victoria, looking immensely pleased, continued. Mr. Carter, can you elaborate? Darren exhaled, shaking his head. Olivia's always been a smart kid, but she's ambitious. Too ambitious. She likes to win, no matter the cost. Olivia's nails dug into her palms. This isn't happening. Darren sighed dramatically. I mean, even as a child, she'd twist things to get her way. She was a little manipulator. Victoria nodded. So you're saying Olivia Carter has a history of dishonesty? Darren hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded.
Yes.
Another wave of murmurs swept through the room. Judge Geraldson pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly frustrated. Ms. Langston, I hope you have a legal point here. Oh, I do, Your Honor. Victoria walked toward the jury, her tone smooth as silk. You see, Olivia Carter has positioned herself as a brilliant young legal mind. A prodigy. But if her own father can't vouch for her integrity, how can we trust anything she presents in this courtroom? She turned dramatically toward the jury. How do we know she didn't fabricate those documents? That was it. That was the trap. And Olivia had just walked straight into it. Victoria had planted doubt. Not about the case. About her. The perfect strategy. Because facts could be proven. But doubt? Doubt lingered. The second the judge called for recess, Olivia bolted from the courtroom. She didn't care about the cameras, the reporters, the stares. She needed air. She pushed through the courthouse doors, her breath coming in sharp, fast bursts. She had been winning. She had proven fraud. And now? Now, people were wondering if she had lied about everything. Hastings caught up to her. Olivia. She spun toward him. They planned this. Hastings didn't deny it. Yeah, and it was damn smart. Olivia's chest tightened. My own father. She shook her head. I don't get it. Why would he do this? Hastings sighed. Because someone paid him to. Olivia's stomach twisted. She hadn't considered that. But it made perfect sense. Darren Carter didn't care about justice. He didn't even care about her. But money? That was something he had always cared about. She clenched her fists. Victoria Langston is playing dirty. Hastings smirked. That's what people like her do. Olivia exhaled sharply. Then I have to play smarter. Back inside the courthouse, Olivia sat at the defense table, her pulse steady now. Victoria was still smirking, enjoying this. Judge Geraldson sighed. Miss Carter, do you wish to cross-examine the witness? Olivia hesitated. She looked at Darren Carter, at the man who had left her and never looked back. No emotion, no regret, and she made her decision. She stood. No, Your Honor, she said. I have no questions for this witness. Gasps filled the room. Even Victoria looked surprised. Judge Geraldson blinked. Are you sure? Yes, Olivia said firmly. Because she was sure. There was no point in questioning a paid liar. And more importantly, she had a different plan. Victoria smiled, thinking she had one. Olivia sat back down, keeping her face blank. Because Victoria had just made a mistake. She had just made this personal. And Olivia was about to show her why that was a very bad idea. The courtroom was still buzzing from Olivia's shocking decision not to cross-examine her own father. Victoria Langston's smirk lingered as if she had already declared victory. She sat back at the prosecution's table, legs crossed, perfectly composed. To everyone else, it seemed like Olivia had given up, like she had taken a devastating blow and had no way to fight back. But inside, Olivia was calculating. She wasn't playing their game. She was setting up her own. Later that evening, Olivia sat in her bedroom, staring at her laptop. A picture of her father filled the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she dug through every record she could find. Old news articles, court filings, anything that could tell her what Darren Carter had been up to in the past 6 years. She had no memories of him being a good man. But now, she needed to prove, legally, that he wasn't a credible man. Suddenly, a knock at her door made her jump. Her mother stepped inside, looking exhausted. Baby, what happened today? Olivia hesitated. Mom, I saw it on the news. Her mother's voice was tight. Your father. She clenched her jaw. That man walked out on us. And now, he's testifying against you? Olivia exhaled. He's working for Victoria Langston. Her mother's eyes darkened. That woman. She's trying to make me look like a liar. Olivia's voice was steady now. But I'm going to flip it on her. Her mother's face softened. Liv, are you sure this is worth it? Yes, Olivia said without hesitation. Her mother sighed. Then do what you have to do. She placed a hand on Olivia's cheek, her voice dropping to a whisper.
But don't become them.
Olivia nodded. I won't. But inside, she knew. She had to fight fire with fire. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the courthouse early, laptop in hand. Hastings was already there, sipping coffee like he had all the time in the world. You look intense, he observed. Olivia sat down. I found something. Hastings raised an eyebrow. Do tell. She turned her laptop toward him. On the screen was a court record. Hastings leaned in, scanning the document. Then, he let out a low whistle. Damn, he muttered. That's bad. Olivia nodded. Darren Carter was arrested 3 years ago for fraud. He took out a fake loan under someone else's name. Hastings smirked. And let me guess, Victoria Langston conveniently forgot to mention that? Of course. Olivia's eyes narrowed.
But I won't.
She shut the laptop and stood. It's time to destroy their star witness. When the trial resumed, Olivia stood with new confidence. Your Honor, she began. I would like to submit new evidence regarding Mr. Darren Carter's credibility as a witness. Victoria Langston's smirk vanished. Objection, she said quickly. This was not submitted in pretrial discovery. Olivia turned to the judge. It wasn't necessary until they made my character the issue. Judge Geraldson sighed. Miss Carter, what evidence do you wish to submit? Olivia held up a court document. Darren Carter was arrested 3 years ago for financial fraud. He took out a $15,000 loan in someone else's name. Without their knowledge, gasps filled the room. Even the jury looked shaken. Victoria shot to her feet. Objection. This is irrelevant to the case. Overruled, Judge Geraldson said immediately. He turned to Olivia. Continue. Olivia nodded. The prosecution called my father as a witness to attack my credibility. But if we're questioning trustworthiness, shouldn't we be asking why we're taking the word of a convicted fraudster? She turned to the jury, her voice clear. If my father was willing to lie to a bank for money, what makes you think he wouldn't lie for money today? Silence. Then, the murmurs began. The jury wasn't buying Victoria's trap anymore. Victoria knew it. For the first time, she looked frustrated. Hastings leaned toward Olivia, whispering, "You just flipped the entire narrative." She didn't smile. Not yet. Because she wasn't done. After the recess, Victoria Langston was ice cold. She had lost her advantage. But Olivia knew she was too smart to go down without a fight. Sure enough, Victoria stood.
Your Honor, I would like to call one final witness.
Judge Geraldson raised an eyebrow. Another surprise witness? Victoria nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I believe this testimony will clarify everything. Olivia braced herself. Victoria turned to the doors. The prosecution calls.
Mr. James Caldwell.
The doors swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit walked in. His presence alone commanded attention. The courtroom whispered. Olivia's stomach dropped. She knew that name. James Caldwell was the CEO of the corporation trying to take Mr. Jenkins' store. And now, he was here, to end this case himself. As he took the stand, Victoria Langston walked toward him, exuding confidence again. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "thank you for coming." "My pleasure," he said smoothly. His voice was dangerous, the kind of voice that had built empires. Victoria smiled. "Mr. Caldwell, can you tell the court, did your company deceive Mr. Jenkins in any way?" "Absolutely not," Caldwell said firmly. "We operated with full transparency." Victoria nodded. "And did Mr. Jenkins knowingly agree to the terms of his contract?" "Yes," Caldwell said without hesitation. Olivia's mind raced. This man wasn't here to argue facts. He was here to sell a story. Victoria turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man being accused of fraud. A respected CEO, a job creator, a philanthropist." She gestured toward Olivia. "And who is making these accusations?" "A teenager who just admitted that her own father thinks she's a liar." The jury shifted. Doubt. Victoria had played her final card. Hastings leaned toward Olivia, whispering, "They're pushing authority. Believe the CEO, not the kid." Olivia knew what she had to do. She stood slowly.
Your Honor, I would like to cross-examine the witness.
Judge Geraldson nodded. "Proceed." Olivia walked toward James Caldwell. He smiled politely, like she was nothing. She stopped in front of him, tilted her head, and asked one simple question. "Mr. Caldwell, how many lawsuits has your company settled out of court in the last 5 years?" Caldwell's smile faltered. A ripple spread through the room. Victoria's expression hardened. "Objection," she snapped.
Irrelevant.
Olivia turned to the judge. "Goes to pattern of behavior." Judge Geraldson nodded. "Overruled." He turned to Caldwell. "Answer the question." Caldwell exhaled slowly. Then, 32. The courtroom exploded. Olivia turned to the jury. 32 cases of people just like Mr. Jenkins, who never got their day in court because they were too small to fight you. She leaned in. "You don't win cases, Mr. Caldwell. You buy silence." Caldwell's jaw clenched. The jury looked stunned. And for the first time, Victoria Langston looked worried, because Olivia had just ripped their entire defense apart, and she was about to deliver the final blow. The entire courtroom was in shock. 32 settlements. 32 cases. James Caldwell sat on the witness stand, his jaw tight, his polished confidence cracking under the weight of the truth. Olivia stood before him, eyes locked onto his. The jury wasn't just listening anymore. They were believing her. She had flipped the script. She wasn't the teenage fraud. She was the only one telling the truth. Victoria Langston knew it. And for the first time in this case, she was losing control. Victoria cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "Mr. Caldwell," she said smoothly, "can you explain why those cases were settled?" Caldwell hesitated. That was all Olivia needed. She turned to the jury. "You don't settle 32 cases unless you have something to hide." Caldwell shifted in his seat. "We settled because we wanted to avoid unnecessary legal fees." Olivia tilted her head. "And yet, you're willing to fight this case in open court?" Silence. A muscle in Caldwell's jaw ticked. Olivia took a slow step forward. "Tell me, Mr. Caldwell, if my client had simply gone away quietly, would you have settled with him too?" Caldwell didn't answer. He didn't have to. The tension in the room crackled. Then, Olivia went in for the final strike. She turned back to Judge Geraldson. "Your Honor, I would like to submit one last piece of evidence." Victoria stood immediately. "Objection. This is highly irregular." Judge Geraldson sighed. He was tired of the games. "Miss Carter, what is this evidence?" Olivia held up her phone. "An email." She turned toward the jury, holding their attention. This email was sent to Mr. Jenkins just 2 days before this trial began. It offered him a large payout if he agreed to drop the case. Gasps erupted through the courtroom. Even Caldwell's own lawyers looked shaken. Judge Geraldson frowned. "Who sent this email?" Olivia's gaze snapped to Caldwell. "The CEO of this company," she said clearly. She held up the phone, the screen visible. And there it was, Caldwell's own name on the sender line. The email was real, undeniable. The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed to type out the breaking news. The jury was done believing Caldwell's lies. Even Judge Geraldson looked furious. Caldwell's face drained of color. He turned sharply to Victoria, but even she had no defense left. She had been outplayed, and she knew it. Olivia exhaled, steadying herself. This wasn't just a win. This was a knockout. Judge Geraldson's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Mr. Caldwell, this court does not take kindly to bribery attempts. I will be launching a full investigation into your company's practices." Caldwell said nothing. His lawyers whispered frantically, but they all knew. They had lost. Judge Geraldson turned to Olivia. "Miss Carter, do you have any final statements?" Olivia stood tall. She turned to the jury, her voice clear. "My client is not a rich man. He doesn't have power or connections. But he does have the truth. And the truth is that this company tried to cheat him. When that failed, they tried to silence him. And when that failed," she gestured toward Caldwell, "they sent their CEO here to lie." She paused, then delivered the final words. "But no matter how powerful someone is, the truth always comes out." Silence. Then, Judge Geraldson exhaled. "I have heard enough." He turned to the jury. "We will proceed to final deliberation." A verdict was coming. As Olivia stepped out of the courtroom, Hastings clapped her on the shoulder. "You just took down one of the most powerful men in the city. How does it feel?" She exhaled. "I'll let you know when my heart stops pounding." Mr. Jenkins, his eyes wet with emotion, grabbed her hands. "Olivia, I don't have the words to thank you." She smiled. "You don't have to." But before they could celebrate, a familiar voice cut through the hallway. "Miss Carter." She turned. Victoria Langston was standing there. Her expression was unreadable. But her eyes were dangerous. "You may have one today," Victoria said, her voice smooth as ever. "But trust me, little girl." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You just made enemies you can't even imagine." A chill ran down Olivia's spine. Victoria smirked. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. The case was almost over. The verdict was coming. But as Olivia watched Victoria Langston disappear down the hall, she knew. This fight was far from finished. The courtroom was silent. The jury had returned. 12 men and women sat in their seats, their expressions unreadable. The weight of their decision pressed down on the room like a heavy fog. Olivia's hands gripped the edge of the table. This was it. Judge Geraldson cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, stood. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." She unfolded a slip of paper, cleared her throat, and read aloud. "In the case of Caldwell Enterprises versus Mr. Henry Jenkins, we find in favor of the defendant." For a second, Olivia couldn't breathe. Then, the courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Mr. Jenkins collapsed into his chair, covering his face with his hands. A mix of laughter and tears shook his body. They had won. They had beaten James Caldwell, beaten Victoria Langston, beaten the system that tried to bury them. Olivia exhaled, relief washing over her. Hastings turned to her, grinning. Well, kid, you did it. She looked at him, still stunned. We did it. Mr. Jenkins grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. I thought I was going to lose everything, he whispered. But you gave me a chance. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. This was never just about a store, she said. It was about justice. Jenkins smiled. And you got it. As reporters swarmed them outside the courthouse, a microphone was shoved in Olivia's face. Miss Carter, how does it feel to be the youngest person to ever successfully argue a legal case? She blinked. She hadn't even thought about that. Another reporter jumped in. Are you planning on becoming a full-time attorney? More cameras flashed. More voices called out. The world had noticed her. Hastings leaned down and whispered, You just became the biggest story in the country. Olivia smiled slightly. Good. But as the celebration continued, she saw her. Victoria Langston stood across the street, arms crossed, watching. Her sharp, polished composure was back. There was no anger on her face, no frustration, just calculation. Then, slowly, she smiled. And Olivia knew. This wasn't over. Not really. Victoria Langston wasn't someone who lost and walked away. She was someone who played the long game. This was only round one. That night, Olivia sat on the roof of her apartment building, staring at the city lights. Her phone buzzed. It was a new email from an unknown sender. She hesitated, then clicked. It was short. Congratulations, Miss Carter. Enjoy your victory. We'll see you again soon. Olivia's stomach twisted. No name, no sender. But she already knew who it was from. Victoria's parting gift. A warning. Or maybe a promise. Because Olivia had stepped into a world far bigger than she'd realized. A world where power played by its own rules. A world where people like Victoria Langston didn't lose. They just waited. Olivia took a deep breath, staring out at the skyline. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. Because if they wanted a fight, she'd give them one.